All right, so as Cherie said, first of all, well, thank you for having me, Cherie. It's really great to be able to still have these types of meetings despite not being able to travel and everyone kind of being stuck at home around the world. So thanks so much for having me. Yeah, as Cherie said, I'm going to be talking about some of my PhD work. It's kind of the culmination of the work that I did throughout my whole PhD. And while I was looking at the Neoproterozoic, it turns out to figure out what's happening in the Neoprote, you need to look at the end of the Mesoproterozoic and look at how Rodinia formed to get some clues as to how to figure out the Neoproterozoic, which is a very, very tricky time. So this research is actually in review at Earth Science Reviews at the moment. And it's a paper that I worked on with Chris Spencer, Bill Collins, Bob Thomas and Paul Macy from South Africa, and Nick Roberts as well. So on the first page here, you can see that we have a very, very early, the first, in fact, reconstruction of Rodinia. And I put that there just kind of as a, I guess, a signpost, because since then there have been many, many, many iterations of Rodinia. We've seen many flavours. So initially the early reconstructions in the 90s from Hoffman and Ian, moving through to more paleomagnetic based work from Sergey throughout the mid-2000s. We have the IGCP group and Lee's very, very famous 2008 reconstruction, a quite radically revised reconstruction here from Evans in 2009. And then the more recent Meredith reconstruction from the G-Plates team that I think everyone's quite familiar with. So while there have been a lot of quite variable reconstructions, something that's quite common throughout all of them is the central position and the relative position of Laurentia, Baltica, Amazonia, and Kalahari in all these reconstructions. And I've coloured each of those continental blocks just so you can spot them easily relative to their current location on Earth today. The other craton that I've coloured in there is the Rio de la Plata craton, which is in some reconstructions and not others, but the ones that it is in, it generally occupies a central location in Rodinia, quite close to or against the Laurentian margin. So we have these four cratons that most people agree were associated with one another and occupied a central location within Rodinia. But the relationship, the exact relationship between those cratons is still under debate. It's still discussed. The piercing points between those four cratons within Rodinia is not entirely clear in the literature. So we've got some work here from Kaywood and Pizarevsky, which follows on from Kaywood's work in 2010, which proposes a clockwise rotation of Baltica from this margin of Laurentia into its final position against Amazonia in Rodinia. We have this Johansen reconstruction, which proposes the Samba configuration, continuing from Nuna into Rodinia time. We then have these two quite varied interpretations of the mechanisms relating to Amazonia's placement in Rodinia. So this is work from Elming from 2009, following on from Tova in 2004, that interpreted the paleomagnetic data to reflect the rotation of Amazonia along the margin of Laurentia. And then in 2013, Dave Evans reinterpreted that paleomag for this quite elegant reconstruction where Amazonia rotates outboard of Baltica to its final resting place in Rodinia, consistent with Kaywood's reconstruction there. We then also have varying placement of different cratons along the Laurentian margin. So I mentioned before the Rio de la Plata craton in Lee's 2008 reconstruction and the Meredith 2017 reconstruction. You can see here and here that the Rio de la Plata craton is occupying that central location against the Laurentian margin. But then work by Stacey Lowy in 2004 and 2003 argued that Kalahari was actually juxtaposed against Amazonian craton recorded by this Arequipa antiphyla block, this intervening block here that links those two cratons together. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Arequipa block now and other similar blocks which record these anchoring positions between the major core cratons in Rodinia. So The Arequipa Antofalla basement is a Paleo to Mesoproterozoic basement block, which now rests in South America along the coastline here, and it records Mesoproterozoic Grenville, high-grade metamorphism, consistent with it being accreted to the Amazonian margin at the time of Rodinia assembly. But the geology of the Arequipa Antofalla basement is not consistent with it growing as part of the Amazon Craton. So Lowy and others interpreted that rather than it being a fragment that's rifted off Amazonia and reaccreted, this is a block that, or part of the Kalahari Craton that was transferred when Kalahari and Amazonia collided in Rodinia and then subsequently broke up. So in this work, we've coined these small blocks anchor terrains. So in this sense, the Arequipa Antofalla basement anchors Kalahari to Amazonia. And there are other similar anchor terrains in other core cratons of Rodinia. So another one that I'm sure most of you that work on Rodinia are familiar with are the Southern Appalachians in Laurentia. So these again are Mesoproterozoic pieces of crust. They've been reworked subsequently, but they have that preserved Grenville high-grade metamorphism. But they also contain zircons that fall within the Laurentian magmatic gap, which indicated that this is a piece of crust that wasn't part of Laurentia until Grenville time. And work from Eric Tova in 2004 suggested that the Southern Appalachians were actually a fragment of an Amazonian crust that was left on the margin of Laurentia. Their interpretation was as kind of Amazonia cartwheeled along the Laurentian margin, a fragment was left off. So the other piece of, the other anchoring terrain that we have is the Oaxaca terrain. So it now resides in Mexico. It was transferred there during Pangean orogenesis. But this is a block that's interpreted to have grown off the margin of Laurentia and was a piercing point between Baltica, sorry, not off the margin of Laurentia, off the margin of Amazonia, and was a piercing point between Amazonia and Baltica, recording this Mesoproterozoic magmatism and records their connection at this time. So a lot of other workers, so primarily Eric Tova and Stacey Lowy, have used lead isotopes to understand relationships between these anchor terrains and their parent cratons. So for this work, we did the same thing. We characterized the basements in terms of the lead isotope composition. So lead isotopes can be used as magmatic tracers, so to trace magma sources and characterize basement. Initial lead ratios of a magma reflects the composition of the source rocks. And then as uranium decays through time, the 207, 204 and the 206, 204 ratios evolve. So rocks with initial higher uranium lead ratios, which is new, will evolve to higher lead ratios. And a suite of rocks that form from the same source with varying mu will form a linear array along in lead space. So you can see a bunch of linear arrays there for each of the 4 cratons. So generally the slope of that linear array is used to calculate the age of the rocks, but as I said, we're going to use the line of regression through that data, as well as the 95% confidence interval to characterize the source terrains. So as you can see from these compiled lead isotope plots, this is all published data, I didn't do any analysis myself. Data from Laurentia and Baltica form linear arrays that lie beneath the Stacey and Kramer's terrestrial array. So that indicates quite a young lead source compared to Amazonia and Kalahari, where their linear arrays sit above the Stacey and Kramer terrestrial array. And that indicates a significant ancient lead component in the source. So importantly, each of these reference lines, each of these linear regressions have an R-squared value above 0.94. So these are really good correlations. And as a result, these linear arrays and their associated 95% confidence intervals are going to be used as the reference lines for each of these 4 cratons when we're comparing the anchor terrain data. And here is said anchor terrain data. So if we start over here, we've plotted the lead data from the anchor terrain against the parent and the daughter craton reference lines. So this is the data from the Southern Appalachians. The Amazon reference line is in orange and the Laurentian is in kind of that blue-green color corresponding to the color of the Cratons there. And you can see that it's pretty clearly that the Southern Appalachian data is plotting well and truly within the Amazon reference line field. Similarly, for the data from the Arequipa Antofalla basement, now those colors aren't as easy to differentiate, but the upper line is the Kalahari reference line and the lower line is the Amazonia reference line. And again, the bulk of the data from the Arequipa Antofalla basement is plotting within the array for the Kalahari reference line, consistent with the interpretations of Lowy and others. And then the data from Oaxaca, plotted against the reference line for Amazonia and Baltica, also shows that the data is pretty well following that Amazonia reference line and lying entirely within the 95% confidence interval. So the lead data is constraining or linking these anchor terrains very well to their parent terrains. And because they now reside in the daughter Cratons, we have piercing points between the parent and the daughter Cratons within Rodinia. So the other thing that these parent Cratons, these core Cratons of Rodinia have in common is that they all record long-lived accretionary orogenesis through the late Paleoproterozoic and the Mesoproterozoic. So in Laurentia, we can see there's outboard younging and Mesoproterozoic accretion, well, Paleo-Mesoproterozoic accretionary orogenesis for about 800 million years from the Archean core. Initially, these 2.0 to 1.8 GA orogens recorded significant reworking of the crustal material, the Archean material. However, that was followed by phases of significant juvenile crustal growth recorded by neodymium isotopes and the development of outboard oceanic arcs from 1.8 to 1.6. This was interrupted by brief compressional episodes which interrupted arc magmatism. And then following the Laurentian magmatic gap from 1.6 to 1.55 GA, juvenile magmatism and crustal growth recommenced at the southern east and eastern margins of Laurentia and continued until about 1.2 GA. The Grenville orogen at about 1.0 GA was recorded continental collision and the final amalgamation of Rodinia. In Baltica, again, Paleo to Mesoproterozoic accretionary orogenesis is characterized by intervals of juvenile magmatism and crustal growth from 1.66 to 1.48 GA. That period was characterized by island arc magmatism and sedimentation back arcs, and the age of magmatism young to the west. It was interrupted by periods of compression, deformation, and continental arc magmatism at 1.63, 1.59, and 1.47 to 1.38. Following that, the 1.4 to 1.1 GA period was dominated by sedimentation, mafic magmatism, consistent with the extension recorded, which is interpreted to reflect rollback of the slab, opening of back arc basins, and the distal outboard migration of the magmatic arc. Baltica then records from 1.1 to 0.9 the Speco-Norwegian orogeny, which is the terminal orogeny associated with Rodinian assembly. Looking at Amazonia and Kalahari now, again, Amazonia records significant accretionary orogenesis throughout the Mesoproterozoic, starting at about 2.0 in the Paleoproterozoic until 1.55. Until 1.25. From 2.0 to 1.55, the arcs and the orogenesis evolved from predominantly juvenile arc magmatism to more isotopically enriched magmatism with reworking of Paleoproterozoic crust. Then from 1.55 to 1.3, the margin recorded predominantly Andean type continental arc magmatism with transient island arc magmatism from 1.37 to 1.32. At 1.33, the margin records accretion of the Paraguay block, and this was followed by cratonization of the region. And then at 1.2, the collisional Sunsasa orogeny records the final amalgamation of Amazonia into Rodinia. The Kalahari Craton in South Africa records voluminous Paleo to Mesoproterozoic magmatism and metamorphism along its southern and western margins. The Kalahari Craton records Paleoproterozoic crustal growth from an Archean core along its margins until about 1.75. And following this, there was a hiatus until about 1.4 GA. And then tectonomagmatic activity was re-established. The Namak-Natal belt developed between 1.4 and 1.0 along the southern and western margins of the Craton. And the Namakwa segment, which is along this margin here, was comprised of Paleoproterozoic and Mesoproterozoic crust, largely derived from long duration, polyphase magmatic and tectonic reworking, of the Paleoproterozoic precursor. So within the Rodinian core, we now have a bit of a picture starting to build. So the core Cratons of Laurentia, Baltica, Amazonia, and Kalahari are constrained through the anchor terrains. Their position is constrained by the anchor terrains. And this configuration defines the juxtaposition of these really long-lived accretionary orogens at the core of Rodinia. So we have within the core of Rodinia these the crust and the orogens younging towards the suture. The age of the initiation of these accretionary orogens on these margins is consistent with the accretionary orogenesis beginning at the margin of the previous supercontinent Nuna at about 1.8 to 1.6. And another implication of this reconstruction is that Rio de la Plata Craton cannot occupy a central location. It may still be kind of hiding within some of these blocks somewhere, but it's certainly not against the Laurentian margin in Rodinia. So yes, of course, there are many more blocks and there's much more to Rodinia, but this is the section that most people can agree on. And so from here, we're going to just talk about this Rodinian core and the implications for a supercontinent assembling in this configuration. So why is it important that there's been juxtaposition of accretionary orogens at the core of this supercontinent? Well, most other supercontinents don't form that way. So this is work from Spencer from 2013, which shows that in Gondwana, generally old crust was juxtaposed against a younger crust. And this occurred through Wilson cycle tectonics, where there's ocean opening, subduction, and ocean closure, where you have a mobile belt developing on one margin of a craton and then collision of the incoming craton. This is a diagram showing kind of assembly of Eurasian continental mass in that form from Collins 2011. So if most supercontinents form by kind of Wilson cycle tectonics and accretionary orogenesis, then why or how did Rodinia form, collisional orogenesis from Wilson cycle tectonics, I think I said accretion then. Then how did Rodinia form by juxtaposing these accretionary orogenesis, these accretionary orogens at its core? So in order to kind of think about that a little bit more as well, it's important to have a look at the link between mantle dynamics and the supercontinent cycle. So this is work from Lee and Zhang from 2009, which is numerical modeling, which shows the development of the degree 2 spherical harmonic plan form relative to the supercontinent cycle. So effectively, it describes the establishment of LLSVPs, one beneath a newly formed supercontinent and one antipodally in the oceanic hemisphere. And these are separated by a subduction girdle, which today is reflected by the Circum-Pacific Ring of Fire, the Circum-Pacific subduction system, and the LLSVPs are the Pacific and the African. So you can see the seismic tomography here showing the Pacific LLSVP, the African LLSVP, and the Circum-Pacific subduction system correlating with mantle downwelling. So rather than these accretionary origins. So in today's world, the circum-Pacific subduction system is associated with accretionary orogens, and therefore the accretionary orogens, long-lived accretionary orogens, are the record of the subduction girdle and give us a link between mantle dynamics and surface geology. So if we can see that there's long-lived accretionary orogens along margins of Cratons in the Mesoproterozoic, then perhaps if we look at the modern example of long-lived accretionary orogens along the margin of the Pacific, we might be able to understand something about what's happening in the past. So perhaps the Panthalassa Ocean or the Proto-Pacific Ocean, which was formed externally to the Gondwanan supercontinent, can tell us something about that. The accretionary orogens along the margin initially started as the Terra Australis origin at about 570 MA along the margins of Gondwana and extended from Australia through to the margin of South America. Now, subduction along that margin has continued since then. So we have about over 500 million years of accretionary orogenesis along those margins and progressive closure of the Panthalassa, now Pacific Ocean, through that time. It's become smaller. So the other thing that's important about these accretionary orogens at the margin of the Pacific Ocean is that they have very, very different expressions in the east and the west. So in the Western Pacific, we have lots and lots of back arc extension, ocean island arcs, and that's a result of a retreating accretionary orogenic system. This is contrasted by what we see in the Eastern Pacific, which is more Andean type, name the Andes, Andean type magmatism and orogenesis. We've got compression and continental arc magmatism, and that's a result of an advancing accretionary orogenic system. And these different styles of accretionary orogenesis actually are recorded by the isotope systematics of the system. So here's some work on the left here by Nelson and Cottle, which shows the hafnium isotope evolution of the Western Terra Australis or circum-Pacific orogens and the eastern circum-Pacific orogens and the western circum-Pacific orogens from about 400 to 180 MA. This is epsilon hafnium space, so the older ages here, younger here. And in terms of hafnium isotopes, more negative values reflect more crustal signatures, whereas more positive values are more mantle-like signatures. So what this is telling us is that in the Western Pacific, where we have more slab rollback, like a retreating accretionary orogenic system, the isotopic systematics record more mantle-like signatures, whereas in the Eastern advancing accretionary orogen, the isotopic signatures are more crustal-like. So if we look at the entire Phanerozoic and a compilation of data from the West Panthalassa or West Pacific and the East Panthalassa or East Pacific origins, we can see that this trend holds true for the entire history, essentially, of the origins. So throughout the entire Phanerozoic, the Eastern Pacific origins have been more crustal-like isotopically, whereas the West has been more mantle-like isotopically. And this is recorded really well if we look at the crustal residence times for each of the origins. So the way that that's calculated is we take the crystallization age of the zircon, we calculate the depleted mantle model age from the hafnium isotope compositions, and then we subtract the crystallization age from the model age and we get a crustal residence time. And the crustal residence, the average crustal residence for the Western Pacific is about 300 million years less than what we're seeing in the Eastern Pacific. So generally younger, shorter crustal residence times are associated with retreating accretionary orogens compared to advancing accretionary orogens. So if we look back to the Mesoproterozoic and evaluate this time period in the same way, then we interestingly see very, very similar trends. So we've already pointed out that in lead isotope space, Laurentia and Baltica are recording younger sources in terms of lead. So we've combined the Laurentia Baltica reference lines together, and they actually still plot on a really nice array with a really great R-squared of 0.97. And then if we combine the Amazonian and Kalahari reference lines, which sit up here above the Stacey and Kramer terrestrial array, indicating that there's more ancient lead in the source, we've combined those and we again get a really good R-squared value. So they sit on really good arrays and are separated very, very clearly. So there's clearly potentially there's two different processes going on between Laurentia and Baltica and Amazonia and Kalahari to contribute to a more radiogenic and a more unradiogenic source of lead. If we look at the hafnium isotopes for the combined Cratons, so here when I'm referring to West extra Nuna, I've made a reconstruction of these four Cratons back to 1.6, and you can see that along this brown kind of area is the mass of the rest of the Nunan supercontinent, and the accretionary orogens built at the margin of these four core Cratons, subducting the extra Nunan oceanic crust beneath them. So in the west, we have Laurentia and Baltica, and in the east, Amazonia and Kalahari. Plotting together hafnium data from the west, from Laurentia and Baltica, in the blue, we can see that the moving average sits generally in more positive hafnium space, giving more mantle-like signatures, where the data from the east, from Amazonia and Kalahari, plots closer to chondritic compositions, indicating a more crustal type source. And obviously, because there's evolution of this system through time, in order to compare kind of apples with apples, I calculated the average crustal resonance for east and west Nuna. And again, there's about a difference of about 300 MA in the average crustal resonance times between Laurentia Baltica, which is shorter crustal resonance, and Amazonia Kalahari, which is longer crustal resonance. So Laurentia and Baltica are more mantle-like, Amazonia are more crustal-like, and this is consistent with what we see in terms of the geology and the evolution of the accretionary orogens on each margin. So for comparison, we can see that West extra Nuna, so Laurentia and Baltica, is similar to the Western Panthalassa, Western Pacific accretionary orogens. And we know that the Western Pacific accretionary orogens are retreating. So perhaps that's also giving us some indication, and the geology certainly suggests that these Western orogenic systems are retreating accretionary orogens compared to the East in each system, which appears to be more of an advancing accretionary orogen. This is reflected as well in the crustal residence times. And also we collected some lead data from the East and West Pacific, or East and West Panthalassa, and even the lead data conforms with what the reference lines for the East and West Nuna give us. So again, in the blue is the combined Laurentia Baltica reference line, or the West Nuna reference line, and data from the Western Pacific plots within that 95% confidence interval. And on the top here, we have the Amazonia Kalahari combined reference line, and the data from the Andes and the Eastern Pacific is plotting within that space. So there appears to be some similarities, possibly genetic or tectonic, in this style of orogens. So what does that mean in terms of supercontinents? Well, perhaps we can get some information from Rodinian assembly, which might tell us something about assembly of the next supercontinent, and vice versa. So we know that these accretionary orogens developed at the margin of Nuna and continued accretionary orogenesis continued throughout the entire Mesoproterozoic. Reconstruction suggests that there was a rotation of Baltica and Amazonia clockwise outboard of Laurentia to collide with it in Rodinia, effectively closing this extra-lunar ocean and juxtaposing these accretionary orogens at the core of the new supercontinent. And that's consistent with the progressive reduction in size of the Panthalassa Ocean throughout the Phanerozoic and the future closure of the Pacific Ocean to form Novo Pangea sometime in the future. That's really important because the dynamics, the geodynamics of Earth today certainly suggest that closure of the Pacific in the current geodynamo is not, sorry, in the current kind of mantle structure is not potentially possible. If we were to close the Pacific Ocean and collapse the circum-Pacific subduction system upon itself, it would be overriding the Pacific LSVP, which is a geode high and generally doesn't make sense. But we've seen this occur in Rodinia, so it's giving us some indication that it is possible. Closure of the Pacific Ocean and juxtaposition of those accretionary orogens through destruction of circum-Pacific subduction is possible. And maybe that's telling us something about the geodynamics of the end Mesoproterozoic and early Neoproterozoic. Given that this subduction girdle, which collapsed to form Rodinia, is indicative of degree 2 mantle convection, does this suggest that the formation of Rodinia meant no more degree 2, and perhaps that the Neoproterozoic was described by some other convective regime? So to sum up, the Panthalassa Ocean provides an analogue for the accretionary orogens bordering the extra-lunar ocean prior to Rodinian amalgamations. The juxtaposition of advancing and retreating accretionary orogens after 800 million years of subduction and orogenesis is analogous to the development of the Terra Australis orogen after Gondwana formation and the future destruction of the Panthalassa Ocean as the circum-Pacific subduction girdle collapses onto itself. The juxtaposition of these two long-lived opposed accretionary orogens is unique in Earth history. Rodinia is the only supercontinent that records this type of supercontinent assembly, but it shows the Pacific Ocean could close in the future despite the present mantle structure. And finally, Rodinia formed by the collapse of the subduction girdle that formed at the margin of Luna. And that's everything. So I'm happy to take questions.